reform of the global economic architecture and a rewriting of the rules for a fairer world economy. That's a rallying cry and mantra all too frequently given voice and amplified in many global platforms. And you can bet the G20 Leaders Summit coming up in exactly 68 days, as well as gatherings related to it, will be no different. Global economic reform, nice sounding catchphrase, but what exactly is its content, and can it be advanced through the G20? Good evening and welcome to it, the second episode of G20 Focus here on SABC News. I'm Thulasizwe Simelane. A recent United Nations Trade and Development Agency report says 3.5 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt interest payments than on their own health systems. 2.7 billion people live in countries that spend more on their debt interest payments than on education. And as of this year, developing countries' external debt has quadrupled in 2 decades to a record, get this, $11.4 trillion. Many attribute the state of affairs to an unfair global economic system that requires change. But what is global economic reform, and why does it matter? Joining me for that discussion this evening, in studio I have Dr. Lumkile Mondi from the Wits Business School, and I'll be joined virtually by Dr. Lebogang Pheko, a senior research fellow at Trade Collective, as well as Professor Carlos Lopes, an honorary professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. So they will also be joining that conversation as well. But let me give you some context and background as we build up to the G20 Leaders Summit. President Cyril Ramaphosa telling us that he is confident that the G20 Heads of State and Government Summit will be held in Johannesburg in November will be successful. The meeting of leaders of the most industrialized countries will grapple with the current global political and economic challenges. Since the start of the war, though, in Ukraine, the group has not been able to agree on declarations of their summits. However, this year's host country is hoping to buck that recent trend.
The milestone was achieved with the holding of the third meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors in July 2025. Remembering that the G20 process really got started to address the financial crisis that the world faced some years ago. The meeting outcomes were agreed in a communique consented to by all parties. The meeting delivered productive and constructive discussions on Africa, the global economic outlook and the macroeconomic stability, the international financial architecture, sustainable finance and global health, infrastructure, tax, financial sector issues, and financial inclusion. Now, these to us were a milestone, because to have gotten the ministerial meeting, which involved Reserve Bank governors and ministers of Treasury, to finally reach consensus and all this, was really, in my view, the heart of what the G20 South Africa is going to mean.
So let's get into the discussion for this evening then. Let me start with you in studio, Lumkile Mondi, and thank you for coming through. The broad question from which we are moving is, what is global economic reform? Before we get to why does it matter, the question itself, the phrase itself and the concept, global economic reform, suggests that there's something that needs to be changed fundamentally with what we have in terms of the global economic architecture and systems. What do we have currently?
An unequal exchange. We've got many developing countries that you mentioned who are highly indebted, well endowed with resources, and yet the resources are determined through the current system of the North. So commodities are either dollar dominated or they're euro dominated, and therefore the price being determined, for example, in the case of commodities, at the London Commodity Exchange And therefore, it means that the price will always favor the North. And the consequences of that is that not only is our wealth being taken out to the North, but also we import products that are made by these mineral resources that we've naturally endowed. And we buy those goods at a far higher price from the North. Therefore, we're losing all the way. We're losing through the production process. We're also losing through the other commodities that we need that are critical for South Africans. And therefore, that has to change, because that unequal exchange is the one that has led to global inequality between the North and the South, has led to massive unemployment in the South, high levels of indebtedness, as we have mentioned, but more importantly also a huge impact on the environment with CO2 emission, which are not because of us, but are as a result of the North. So we find ourselves with these problems, arguing that those reforms have to happen, whereby the balance of exchange has to at least be equal, if not favor us, given that historically it's been against us.
Yeah. Let me bring in Lebogang Pheko. Dr. Pheko, good evening. Just your own perspectives and reflections on the current global economic architecture. The question I posed is, if we are saying that what we have needs to change fundamentally, what in your understanding is it that we have at the moment such that we are talking about needing to reform it?
So thanks for the question. I think the one thing, when we think about reforming the global economic architecture, it traverses redefining rules, redefining institutions, and also, most importantly, to the point that Dr. Mondi has just made, redefining power relations so that our economic outcomes are far more inclusive, far more equitable, and far more sustainable, both for the global South and for the global North. But particularly, this leads us to think around issues of much more equitable debt governance, much more equitable governance that reflects a multipolar world rather than a unipolar world, one which is very much rooted and anchored in the interest and the power play of Europe and the US, quite significantly and overwhelmingly, and rules that curb the kind of extractive practices and policies that should, in fact, prioritize development in a sovereign state, human welfare over short-term market liberalization. This also means that we have to rethink and reform the trade and financial systems and rethink the history of how these systems came to be. And I think there's no escaping that a lot of the global architecture has a recent colonial history, and that unfortunately the power relations that we see playing themselves out right now mean that we have to rethink the representation of developing and global South countries, majority world countries in global decision-making institutions, but also wonder whether those institutions were ever fit for purpose, and that's possibly a more controversial question.
Dr. Pheko, I think let me stick with you because you've broached the subject of the history of how we got here. If we take a step back then, how did we end up with a system that the global South and developing nations, and Africa in particular, feel is not fair in terms of its balance and its skew on these matters of development and trade? How did we end up here?
Basically, remember that the Bretton Woods institutions were set up in 1944, and they were basically around the U.S. and 44 allied nations. What has happened since then in the IMF, the GATT, and so forth, were then also intended to stabilize currency and to rebuild post-war European and U.S. economies. This also was linked to commodity dependency. It was also linked to things around the way that, for example, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was later called the World Bank, was intended to fund northern countries, minority world countries' development. And the main goal was actually to prevent the repeat of the 1930s trade wars amongst Europe, basically the intra-European tribal wars and deflationary wars, and to promote stable exchange rates. Now, come the 1950s and the 60s and the ascension of several African and Asian countries and Latin American countries, into the so-called global polity as we got our independence, or so it seemed at the time. We then were pulled into these, many of these institutions, seen as part of governance, seen as part of our own, increasing global influence. And of course, there's been tensions and criticisms ever since then. The North-South power imbalances, the governance structures, the vote and the quotas, which heavily favor the United States and major Western powers.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when we go into the 1980s and 90s, the IMF and the World Bank policies that were tied to debt relief programs, whereas African countries now are almost expected as part of good governance to become highly indebted or to sign off on market access in ways that are deeply undemocratic, which in a nutshell is how we find ourselves here.
All right. So we will touch on some of what you already touched on there, Dr. Pheko. For instance, issues to do with the voting power of various countries in some of these institutions. But I do want to dwell a little bit more, Dr. Mondi, on the basics so that we all move from the same page, right? You often hear of people saying that we are operating under the Washington consensus, that these institutions that we are going to talk about at length later on in the show are not merely institutions that are part of the architecture of the world in terms of funding and financing development, but actually they are also linked to geopolitics and the interests of the countries that control them. Talk to me about the Washington consensus and why people find it to be problematic, why it has been problematized over a period of time.
Yeah, so let me just briefly talk about the South African role, because I think South Africa is a very significant player in the formation of the architecture. Through General Smuts, both in the war towards the settlement and the formation of the institution that Dr. Pheko so eloquently explained. What is very important is also the underpinning of the whole system with the gold standard. Remember, South Africa is the world's largest gold producer in that period. It underpins these systems. So therefore, it was the weakness of some Americans in the late 60s, early 70s, who basically broke away from the gold standard. Because that time, remember, if it is South African rand, for foreigners, let's say Americans, for Americans to buy a South African rand, they need $1.20. That's how strong the rand was, because the system is underpinned by us. Yeah. So that breakaway by the Americans, fueled by the Middle East crisis in the early 70s, which led to the oil prices spiraling, and of course, highly indebtedness of Argentina, led to the whole continent collapsing, and therefore the liberals within the American system brought in a new system, which today we call neoliberalism. Because in that period, Thulas, many countries, through the reconstruction and Keynesianism that underpinned the settlement after 1944, they favored government-led development. So they were highly indebted, and in that process could not service those deficits. Therefore, the neoliberals argued that government must be smaller, so there's massive privatization of key assets in many of the welfare states, including Britain. Margaret Thatcher being the architect of it, selling public assets to the private sector, reduce employment in the public sector, and for developing countries, you basically need to be export-driven, privatize key assets, and also lower deficit to 3% or below. So these characteristics I'm talking about is what is become Washington consensus. So I thought that let me look at it historically.
That's from
a left-wing Keynesian approach to a hijack by the Americans into what you call today neoliberalism, which basically, just conclude the point, which basically meant that from political power, which America had, and away from production, finance became the center of economic development. So when you're selling these assets, which were productive. Remember, many of the state-owned assets were either in the health sector,
Yeah.
in the habitat sector,
Yeah.
with building houses for soldiers or family soldiers who had died in the war, were in education. So you took away productive
I like
economic development into finance.
I like
thought
that
that's very
explanation. Let me pause on it and then I'll pick up just after the break and explain and get Dr. Pheko perhaps to add onto it and explain how that system that has just been explained in the last few minutes layers into these institutions that we will talk about a bit later, and how developing countries in particular access financing for development. That conversation and a lot more coming up in a moment. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus on SABC News. Before we continue with the conversation, let me say this. There's no gainsaying that the G20 Leaders Summit takes place amid an environment of policy uncertainty. The rules of the game are changing right before our eyes. So let's show you then what that is looking like in terms of sentiment and understanding. This was a poll that was done among just sampling of media coverage of trade policy uncertainty. In the main, among the main, publications and titles in the United States covering this area of trade policy uncertainty. And it was done over a period of time from April 2016 comparing to where we are in March 2025. Look how sharply it rises. Look, it's not just about it rising over a period of time, it's just how sharp the curve goes up in terms of that uncertainty between 2024 and 2025. So we'll pick up on that conversation in a moment with you, Dr. Lumkile Mondi. But I wanted Dr. Pheko to weigh in on the conversation we were having just before the break, Dr. Pheko, about the Washington consensus, the insistence on certain reforms. In some instances in your public finances in a country, and in other instances the value-laden reforms that institutions will then insist upon. Tell me about the layering of that and how it aligns with the beliefs and values of the countries that dominate some of these institutions.
So, the core tenets, I think, as I linked Dr. Mondi's very helpful remarks earlier on, which are around fiscal discipline, reordering public expenditure priorities, which is public welfare, health, education, and subsidies, really turning citizens into clients and consumers. It also is linked to tax reform, liberalizing interest rates, which can be very problematic, competitive exchange rate, and one has to ask what is competitive in the context of deeply depreciating currency, especially current countries from the majority world, which makes trade much more difficult and much more expensive for us. Trade liberalization, and of course liberalization of so-called foreign direct investment. It also links to privatization of state enterprises and legal security for property rights, which is something that we often don't speak to, and generally the whole notion of deregulation. So really, it's really adjusting states, and when you say how does this link to the ideologies or the worldview of those particular countries, it means that their loans and their debt relief come with conditionalities, and that these often require austerity and privatization, especially as Dr. Mondi said, in the context of countries which have become largely privatized. So you have the welfare state, which was largely dismantled under Thatcherism. You have, the social services and the social welfare packages across the United States, which under Reagan were also largely dismantled. So this is also to do with the way that the global north or the minority world is beginning to treat their own citizens as end users, as clients. And the context, of course, is completely different to ours, where we don't have a social wage. We don't, for the most part, in most majority world countries, have the kind of social wage or the dole, the basic grants people have been talking about, which would actually people from these various parties.
Yeah. Dr. Pheko, your line is fading. Your line is fading on us. Let's see if we can dial you back and see if we can get you on a better line. Dr. Mondi, back in studio. So perhaps to make it more relatable then, for someone watching this from South Africa, does what we've been talking about partly explain what has been criticized as austerity budgeting, the whole concept of a country like South Africa being saddled with the kind of debt that it's saddled with. Sure, you've got internal dynamics that are at play there, but the kind of policy approach that you take to that debt, is that informed then by some of what we've been talking about?
So South Africa is quite interesting in the sense that by the time it democratizes, it's because it's financially non-viable. Remember the 1985 August speech by Botha, the Rubicon speech, which had a huge impact on institutions like Eskom, who had huge exposures internationally, because the rand crashed after that speech, as everyone was rushing out of the door from South Africa. So the ANC, as it comes in the South African case, is that it's got very, very little option. I know that Habib, Bond, and many others may argue that were options who took the wrong way. But really, it's very, very difficult when people were fighting for liberation and the focus was getting freedom, human rights, and all the things talk about, and we didn't so much talk about the economy. And suddenly, people asking about the economy. So that lost opportunity, I think, and hunger for power by the ANC and many black organizations at that period in time, basically embeds them within the neoliberal framework, and therefore limits on what possible can be done in that, because they are all concerned about political power, less about economics, as Padayachi and Fanika have written about this issue through that. So the point I want to make to us is that many developing countries, because of our links, intellectual and otherwise, with the global north. Because remember, your elite in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, your elite tends to go to universities in the north. So they're either at Harvard, or they're at SOAS, or they're in any of those institutions. Therefore, the pedagogy that they get there, they imbibe it. And when the IMF and World Bank say, go to a country, they implement it. And hence, that's what you have in many of our countries, so that the elite has bought into the global neoliberal order. And therefore, citizens are at the mercy of the elite, because the elite is preoccupied with its importance, with power and its relationship with the north, and forget about the people, and hence we have these problems.
So let's talk to that context then. That's the context I was showing now in terms of the trade policy uncertainty, just how quickly it has shot up in that graphic that we were showing. That's part of the context of the G20 Leaders Summit. With that context, does the summit and the work being done right now under the South African presidency of the G20 conduce to the global economic reform that we are talking about?
No. Remember, we're in a political crisis. The world has got no leadership at all. So the settlement leadership, they want to talk about the generals, General Lansmats, Churchill, and Roosevelt, and many others in the US, were committed to their people. So even though they were engaged in war, but they were driven by success of their people. This leadership is preoccupied with its importance, whether it's in the north or is elsewhere. So therefore, it provides opportunities for opportunists who are powerful, who are linked to business. Because if you look at work done by Susan Strange, she talks about looking at social power, talks about security, talks about finance, production, as well as knowledge. So the knowledge base internationally has shrunk tremendously, and hence we're all reverting to populist rhetoric, and in doing so, creating this polycrisis. So I think the G20 discussion, it is there for us for a spectacle, but we need a much more broader conversation that similar to the President Woods one, where the other countries not at the table can come in and engage, and the UN is a good platform for that. But even the UN, because it's captured by the North, and the North will do whatever it takes, therefore it brings BRICS into the table. Will China take the mantle and bring in the other BRICS parties for a new global order. That's the contestation that we're looking at.
You set up very nicely where we're going to go next with that discussion, Dr. Lumkile Mondi. So stay with us. This is G20 Focus. On the other side of the break, we go straight into the heart of that discussion about who is at the table as the global economic reform agenda is being discussed, and what power do they wield, and are there players that are beginning to say, is it possible to carve out different pathways in terms of financing of development, in terms of access to capital and borrowing and the likes? That and a lot more coming up in a moment. Welcome back to G20 Focus. Let's pick up the conversation now with Professor Carlos Lopes, Honorary Professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. You're catching the conversation as it's quite heated here on G20 Focus, Prof. But nevertheless, let me get your first thoughts about, we are at a point where we're discussing who's at the table when conversations about the global economic architecture, the financing for development, but also even in times of crisis, how that plays itself out. Which voices are represented at the table, and to what extent do they point to the need for the reform of the global economic architecture?
Well, we can easily admit that there are asymmetries, and the G20 is a reflection of the 2008-2009 crisis, basically reinforcing the need for a response that was a bit more coordinated. Although the group existed before, it was during that period that really gained traction. And I think what is important for us to admit is that these asymmetries have been sort of navigated through processes outside the UN, precisely because there was a need to have a smaller group. And the G20 was supposed to be the largest economies. The criteria is clear, but the application of the criteria is a bit political. Some countries are not really within the largest 20, but they are there nevertheless. Others that should be there are not, but that's besides the point. I think what is important for us to admit is that now we are entering a phase where all legacy institutional arrangements are being contested. And the G20 is just one of them. We have the same problem with the WTO, World Trade Organization. We have the same problem with international law in general, and we have definitely the same problem within the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank. So what I think Africans should realize is that we that have benefited the least from these legacy arrangements should not be the ones defending them as if it was something that we really benefited from. We didn't.
Yeah.
So this is the time where we can exercise a bit of agency, and we can demonstrate that maybe we can shape the new. And definitely new will come, because I don't think these structures will survive.
Wow, that's an interesting take. You don't think these structures will survive? As we talk about that point, and you say a bit more about that point, Prof, I do want to show what we're talking about in terms of the voting patterns and voting power as represented in, for example, the International Monetary Fund. There you have it. You see the numbers there. In terms of voting power, the United States, Japan, Germany, France, those kinds of countries dominate by far, and I mean by far. I mean, if you look at the numbers, for example, the US is 16.5% in terms of voting rights. Japan, 6.14% in terms of voting rights. Countries on the African continent, it's under 1%, including countries like South Africa, which is a member of the G20. Prof. Lopes, if I stick with you for a moment, you're making the point that you don't believe these structures will survive. Take that point to its logical conclusion. What do you mean by that? What will make them not to survive in the current context, given everything else that's happening geopolitically?
We have been living under a construct that is the result of commitments made since the Second World War, but have been firmed up in a series of covenants in the 90s. Different global conferences have shaped the current international system and its global governance. And what we are seeing is that the most important players in the current arrangements are no longer playing ball. They are no longer adhering to the rule book that they have imposed. And if they are not adhering to the rule book, is because they believe the Global South's most powerful countries are now benefiting from the current arrangements more than they thought they would. Case in point, China, but you can go beyond China. You can include India. You can include definitely Brazil and a number of other very important countries from the Global South. So as a result, there is no interest in really preserving exactly the same arrangements. So when I say that these organizations and these structures will not survive, it doesn't mean they will disappear tomorrow.
Yeah.
There will be an inertia effect that will, basically take their power slowly, like, you are taking oxygen out, and then eventually you die. But you are going to die with arrangements that are going to be emerging on a completely different basis. Spheres of influence is the new ball game, and with that, bargaining is more important than consensus.
Sure. Dr. Pheko, let me throw this at you. All right, I'm told we don't have her on the line. Let me throw it at you, Dr. Mondi. What do you make of that? Bargaining power as opposed to spheres of influence, and this whole idea that new consensus may be emerging, perhaps even in regional blocks. To what extent are these traditional ways of doing things being challenged?
I don't think, my view is that many of the Global South, although publicly they will articulate the position that Professor Lopes is talking about, they are completely locked into the existing order. Remember our discussion in South Africa about rebuilding infrastructure. It is a discussion that is private sector led. The whole drive that we're talking about earlier of tariffs is the dominant. So my argument, to complement what Professor Lopes said, my argument is that there's been a shift away from the politics into multinational cooperation. So the most powerful institution today are no longer the political institution or the leaders, but the leaders are in the passes of the multinational corporations. So if you look at the top 7 global companies, they've got everything about us. Thulasizwe. If you've got an Apple computer, they know everything about you. They can sell anything. They can monitor movement, etc. So the power of multinational corporation is the one that will shape the new order. That's for me. That's where I think the discussion is not going. The discussion is focused on this institution. When the power is shifted completely, it is the multinational corporation today. I think that's the most powerful institution.
As a player,
that will shape the new agreement. Because we go into politics because we are in the pockets of these corporations who are fighting very, very hard, using technology to influence the new agenda, which should ensure that as long as the profit is maximized, as long as the rate of return is maximized, they'll control the order, they'll control the rules of the game, and they'll buy us, those of us as politicians, to effect what they want to do.
Sure, that's an interesting one. Dr. Pheko, do you want to weigh in on this? The role of multinationals and private capital in this whole conversation where we are talking about the global economic system and the reforms that are needed to. Is it shifting us away from that age-old conversation about needing capital to be disciplined to a situation where capital may be the ones doing the disciplining?
So, these are not just actors in terms of private capital. They are not only economic actors, but they've always been and remain deep political influencers, standard setters, trend setters, and the gatekeepers of development finance, especially when we understand that there are many countries there are many multinational companies who at the World Trade Organization and within other Bretton Woods have the capacity to sue sovereign states. They have more local standi than actual states and actually have more capital value than many nations. So this is a huge imbalance here. And I think the other piece of this is that even though it's been said that multinationals bring technology, bring capital, bring jobs, and bring skills, what they've also done is to, in many instances, they have reduced and eroded deeply innovation, inventiveness, creativity. It is no coincidence that many of us are beholden, as we speak right now, to Microsoft at the expense of the multiplicity of other possible service provider. And these are predominantly, again, based in the minority world, the global north. The other thing is, of course, that what multinationals are also shapers of global supply chains. They dictate trade flows. They're often and the majority world, global south countries, we are often the suppliers of raw materials and the low value labor that locks us into these dependent positions. And I think the other concern with multinationals is that through their lobbying and their legal challenges and trade agreements, they're often able to shape national and global economic policies way beyond their democratic dividends.
Right.
Nobody votes for them, and yet they influence tax policy, trade and investment rules, and climate policy, for example.
All right, let's pause it there for a moment. In the next few minutes, I want to take the discussion in the direction of the G20 itself then. In light of all of these realities that we are discussing, would the G20 play that role of being the instrument that begins to drive the conversation about the reforms that we are talking about? That and more coming up on the other side of this break. Welcome back. You're watching G20 Focus. Let me just show you a picture that's emerging in as far as international indebtedness of countries is concerned. That split and comparison between developing nations and developed nations. You can see there those two lines on that graph going up, but going up at different rates. The one at the bottom is developed nations. So in terms of their outstanding public debt, that rate of increase is not as sharp if you compare with the rate of increase for developing nations. So there you have it. Between 2010 and 2023, that's been the trajectory of public debt for these two types of countries: developed at the bottom, developing at the top. So it just gives you a picture, because, for instance, debt distress, we're told now that it looms over more than half of the 68 low-income countries that are eligible for International Monetary Fund, Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. And also we're told high interest rates are worsening the burden. That in 2023, for example, developing nations paid, get this, $847 billion in net interest, a 26% increase from 2021. So that is the situation as it stands. Professor Lopes, let me pick up the conversation with you then and ask you, with those realities that we are talking about, I know that your passion is with the African continent, and it's no coincidence because you have served in many capacities advancing the case for Africa, right? Does the G20 provide a pathway? What in the G20's makeup and its way of doing things, the consensus-based approach, almost informal, what in that architecture would make it the vehicle that perhaps starts to drive the agenda for the reform that would begin to change the picture that I was painting a moment ago?
Well, the South African presidency of the G20 has decided to establish an Africa expert panel that deals with the issue of debt and cost of capital. And I'm very honored to serve on that panel. This is a follow-up to a number of initiatives that the government of Brazil, that preceded South Africa, also undertook in relation to the issues of debt distress. Now, I think it's important to correct a bit the perception that your graph may transmit, because in fact, what counts in terms of debt is not the volume alone, but also the fact that we have to compare with the size of the economies. So if you do that, so the debt to GDP ratio, as we call it, you will see that the African countries have a debt to GDP ratio of 60%. which means that their debt is equivalent to 60% of the size of their economies, which, by the way, statistically are underestimated. We know this from various projections, but be as it may, that's the figure. Whereas the countries that belong to the club of the Western developed nations, the OECD, have a debt-to-GDP ratio of 120%, twice the size of Africa and above the size of their economies. So they should be the ones on that distress, not us. So why is it that we are the ones affected? We are affected by a number of reasons. The first reason is that we pay interest rates that are very high. So while we pay an average 11% in Africa, a country like Germany pays 0 point something. So obviously, if you are going to have a loan for buying a house and your neighbor is paying 11%, you are going to pay 0 something, obviously you are in a better shape.
Yeah.
The second is that they dominate the currencies where this debt is denominated. So you can just print, whereas we cannot print because we pay it in euros or dollars or currencies we don't control. Third, we have a tax difficulty because most of our exports are commodities. We don't control the prices of commodities. They are controlled elsewhere. So our number one revenue is compromised in terms of how much taxation can come from those exports. And fourth, we are actually paying a cost of capital not only in terms of interest rates, but also in terms of access. We have less access than others. So we have problems of rolling over. Our risk assessments make the conditions for payment much more harder and, with shorter terms and so on. So for all those reasons, it looks like what should have been fantastic, the fact that we have only half of the exposure that the developed countries have, becomes a torment because we can't control these factors. That's why the G20 has to be alerted that a lot of the regulatory systems that are creating the problem have to change.
Yeah. Dr. Mondi, very quickly, that risk premium in that equation of what Professor Lopes was describing, that's a major conversation, isn't it, in the global architecture? The whole perception of risk in lending, in extending capital to Africa, it's not realistic, is it, in many instances?
Yeah, because remember, it prescribes a particular ideology into developing countries. First, you have to be democratic. And secondly, because the governance must be right. So all these things are imposed upon you. And therefore, you have the more democratic you are, the proper there's independence of the Reserve Bank.
In fact, we've got some of those conditions. I'll show them in a moment.
Yes, if you've got those conditions, your risk premium will shrink a little bit, and therefore pay less.
All right.
So it is that ideology, I think, and the constraint that is imposed upon governments to conditionality that's a problem.
All right, let me pause.
There's a theory. There is a theory called MMT in South Africa. So in the world. In South Africa, there are lots of proponents for it. My colleagues, Professor Lumkile and others, are arguing that if you are a South African Reserve Bank, for example, why don't you finance your government? Why does government have to go international to borrow foreign currency? Just print money, give government, let government do the whole thing. So there's a whole debate going on in this restructuring of the architecture.
I'm keen to hear what your own thinking on that theory is, but I'll do that in a moment. You're watching G20 Focus on SABC News. I'm coming back with my guests in just a moment. So as we approach the close of today's show, I want to get the closing thoughts of all my guests. But before I do that, let me quickly let Dr. Mondi finish the point that he had started making towards the break. Let me show you this graphic very quickly that shows some of the conditions that are usually attached to, for example, an IMF loan, where some of them have clear austerity measures that you have to adhere to. So fiscal consolidation, increase of revenues from VAT, measures to reduce or remove energy subsidies, and those are accompanied by certain mitigating factors. I want you to conclude the point you were making. Modern monetary theory is what you were talking about.
Yes.
And you were saying some of your colleagues believe in it and feel strongly about it. Your own thoughts very quickly.
It is constrained by the existing global economic order, where South Africa basically gave away all its power by the agreement that we signed up to in the transition. But second, also constitutionally, it is limited for that by us embedding the independence of the Reserve Bank and giving it all the responsibilities. So it will be very, very, very hard.
Yeah.
But more important also, remember that in South Africa, you won't believe it. You experience it because you probably don't have water or you've got lots of potholes in the streets. That, the current African nationalists don't believe in development at all. Because if they did, they will do whatever it takes to do the things that the MNT talks to. Because it empowers them to achieve development and inclusivity, addressing poverty and inequality. But they're too scared to do that because they're bought into that extinct global order.
All right, let's bring it to a close nicely. Dr. Pheko, let me start with you. What for you will represent a successful hosting of the G20 Leaders Summit with regard to the conversations we've had this evening? Given also the context that we painted earlier on, the difficulty to agree on summit declarations of the last few years. So what will South Africa need to do as host and president to at least signify some progress for you?
Sure. I mean, my expectations are very, very modest, especially because, as we know, it is not legally binding and there are so many geopolitical divisions. But the one would be debt reform, pushing for much faster, much more equitable debt restructuring, a common framework, and perhaps private creditor participation. And I think to propose African debt transparency standards and an African debt resolution platform. Another might be, of course, the reform of multilateral institutions, notwithstanding Professor Lopes's remarks, with which I am deeply sympathetic, but certainly in the meantime, to rethink the voting power at both the IMF and the World Bank, although I do view them both as quite toxic institutions. And the other would be private regulation, private capital regulation. So to call for mandatory ESG standards, to climate risk disclosure and responsible investment practices. And finally, I think around digital and trade justice. So to advocate for much clearer digital economic rules. We keep talking about, we need to understand that the world of 4A education, of the inequities and the exclusions that we see in the so-called real world.
All right. Professor Lopes, your final thoughts on this. What for you will represent a modicum of success in advancing global economic reform on the other end of the summit in South Africa?
I think, sometimes in these gatherings, you don't gain an outcome, you gain a debate, in the sense that you change the narrative and you put on the agenda something that is new. And if South Africa really manages to push the idea that the cost of capital, the prohibitive cost of capital in Africa is unacceptable, given the reduction of ODA, given the lack of interest in supporting climate finance and all the promises that have been made, let's turn all those negatives into something that would allow the exercise of some agency on the part of South Africa, and then the host will be successful. Because, just having the G20 is already a success of sorts.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for your time this evening. I've got to thank all my guests having joined us on this evening's edition of G20 Focus. That's it. That will do it for this week. Join us again next week, and we'll be discussing financial markets stability, integrity, and regulation. You don't want to miss that. Cheers.